Hello, welcome to the Comic Book Commentary. I'm Bo Leidig, and this week we're going to be diving right back into our ongoing retrospective look at Spawn with Spawn number 26. So let's zoom in and take a closer look. First published in December of 1994, we can see here on the cover Spawn looking rather depressed in what looks to be a relatively nice looking environment, but he has good reason for the feelings that he has and is portraying in this image, as we will find out when we read this comic book. But overall, it's a decent image. We also notice that this is drawn, I believe, by Greg Capullo and inked, I believe, by Todd McFarlane. I say I believe because it's not really explicitly stated anywhere that that's the case, but it seems to almost certainly be the case, as this very much looks like Greg's pencil work and Todd's ink work. Story: Todd McFarlane. Art: Todd McFarlane and Greg Capullo. Copy editor and letters: Tom Orzechowski. Color: Steve Oliff and Ollie Optics. We see here the New York skyline being portrayed on the first page of the book, and we get an opening monologue about how, most people don't go out of their way to try and be evil, but that they're corrupted, and that the source of that corruption is very often money. And it goes on to talk about how money itself is evil, and that's stated in the Bible, which I don't believe is actually the case, that money is ever explicitly stated as being an evil thing in the Bible. But at any rate, that's what it's going by in this book. And it talks about how, the more money you have, the more evil you have in your life, and that it's this weird balancing act because you need money to operate in the world, but it's always corrupting you the more of it you get. But if you don't have enough of it, you can't operate and function in this world, which is what leads us to a new character being introduced who is finding out exactly what happens when he doesn't have the money necessary to operate in this world as he needs to. We're then introduced to one Mr. Fred Barnett. Now, Mr. Barnett is arguing with his publicly appointed defendant. He unfortunately is in the process of losing custody of his daughter. This is because his wife died, and he apparently lost everything and is now living in a terrible apartment and doesn't have a job and doesn't really have any money and can't really provide for his daughter. Now, you might notice that Mr. Barnett is actually quite old. This is because he and his late wife adopted a young girl in their old age, and she is now 14, but unfortunately, due to their older age, his wife passed away unexpectedly. I don't know if it was because of cancer or some other illness. It's not really explicitly stated, but this caused Mr. Barnett to deal with a lot of grief and also lose a lot of the money that he and his wife had, to the point where he's essentially living in squalor now. He's arguing with his attorney, stating that, this isn't fair. His daughter wants to stay with him. And he's like, what am I paying you for? And the attorney reminds him, you're not paying me at all. And your daughter's being taken away because you can't prove to the court system that you can provide to her. He then hangs up, and Mr. Barnett just kind of wallows in self-pity and wonders, how he got to this place. The next day in the court, he tries to plead with the judge, stating that, he's lost everything. His daughter is all he has left, and that she's lost everything as well. And that, she wants to stay with him, and he doesn't think that it's right that the court should take her from him. The judge does agree that his daughter wants to stay with him, but also agrees that they have indeed lost everything, and that Mr. Barnett hasn't worked in nearly a year and has no money and has no real way of providing for a child, and that the judge then sees fit to put her in an environment which is more conducive to being stable for her and being able to provide her with food and shelter and clothing and the things that she needs. And she understands the situation that Mr. Barnett is in and is, trying to be as gentle as possible with him, because she realizes that he's not this terrible guy who was abusing his child or purposely neglecting her. He just is in a situation that he didn't expect to be in and lost his ability to provide for her. She does state that he can try and, reapply for custody in the future, as his daughter is not being, adopted. She's just being put in the foster system. However, Mr. Barnett believes that this is just her trying to placate to him, and that in reality, he'll never be at a point where he'll have enough money to try and revisit this decision, and that he's going to lose his daughter forever. Meanwhile, in the 8th circle of hell, we see the Mabalja sitting atop his throne as he begins to gloat about what it is that he's trying to do, as he sits above some lesser hellspawns who were not given the opportunity to go back to Earth, and some also demons that are just kind of in the general area. He tells them how, he sends these hellspawns back to Earth, making deals with them that they can't possibly get out of, and how the ball's always in his court, no matter how much they try to figure out a way out of the deal they've made with him, or try to change the outcome that he's created. They're always powerless to do so in the end, and that he's always the one who's holding all the cards. And then he actually invites them all to come closer and listen to his story about the current hellspawn on Earth, one Al Simmons. Meanwhile, back on Earth, Al Simmons, aka Spawn, is kind of just wallowing in his own self-pity, as he realizes that he hasn't been able to accomplish his main goal for trying to come back, and that's to win back his former wife, Wanda, who is now currently married to his former best friend, Terry Fitzgerald. His whole life I guess afterlife at this point, has been an absolute mess. He's constantly being, harassed by the mafia, the cops, the government, cyborgs, demons, you name it. It's all been thrown his way, and it's all been keeping him from trying to achieve the goal that he came back to achieve in the first place. And at this point, it's really starting to drag down his spirits. We then see that Spawn is just sitting by himself in a pile of trash as he tries to contemplate the entire situation. He is happy about the fact that he's no longer hiding his existence and that he's made himself known to the world. But outside of that, he feels like he hasn't made any progress whatsoever. It's been months since he's seen Wanda face to face, and he feels like overall he's just stalling. However, it's at this point that he's interrupted by a familiar face that we haven't seen in quite some time, as Cagliostro makes his appearance once again. We haven't seen him since issue 9, where he first appeared, and he tells Spawn that he's not stalling, he's acquiring knowledge. Spawn almost doesn't recognize him, but then as he steps into light, he realizes who he's talking to, and he asks Cog, how do you know so much about all of this? Who are you? What the hell are you? I want to know what's going on. Cog tells him that, the whole thing that's been going on with Spawn is all by the Mabalja's design. He's essentially put him in a place where, he lied to Spawn and kind of told him, or led him think anyway, that he was going to get something that he wasn't. And this is because Spawn apparently didn't know his rights when he made the deal. Or at least that's the way Cog puts it, which is kind of crazy, because he's essentially telling Spawn that had he specified exactly what he wanted when he made the deal with Mabalja to come back to the world of the living, that he potentially could have had it. And it's because he just, brashly and, irrationally said, I want to go back to my wife, without making any kinds of stipulations or specifications in that deal. Mabalja decided to throw him back on Earth 5 years in the future and was like, here, you can see her, but you're never going to have her back. And of course, this all falls into the Mabalja's plan, as we find out that, Cog's telling him that this is all due to the fact that Spawn showed so much potential as a gifted military officer while he was alive, that Mabalja wants to utilize that in his war against Heaven, and that he fully plans on integrating Spawn into his army, and that everything that he's doing to him here on Earth is to make sure that Spawn winds up back in hell as soon as possible, so that Mabalja can start molding Spawn into exactly who he wants him to be, and that the deal he made with him was really just a way to get Spawn to agree to be one of his generals, and he could care less about whether or not Spawn actually gets anything that he wants out of it. Meanwhile, back in Hell, we see that Mabalja is continuing to regale all of the demons and Hellspawn around him with the tale of exactly what his plans are. We find out at this point that the souls who wind up here in Hell are not necessarily just from Earth. They're from every planet and every dimension, which is kind of crazy. This is where we find out that, at least in the Spawn universe, the afterlife is the same for all beings, no matter what level of existence they're on in terms of Earth or some planet in a faraway galaxy or in a completely different dimension. They all wind up in the same afterlife, which is pretty weird and kind of unique. I don't know that I've ever seen this for other comic books or other stories. He explains that once he's made the deal with any Hellspawn that he sends back to the world of the living, they only have two options. They can either go forward with Mabalja's plan and send more souls to Hell and fill out the ranks of his army and become the leaders that he wants them to be in his army, or they can disobey him, at which point, when they do die their second death, go back to Hell and face him, that he's going to spend the rest of eternity torturing them for basically not honoring their end of the deal and frustrating him, which means they got really crappy options. He also notices that the demons and Hellspawn around him are kind of puzzled as to why Al Simmons was chosen for this. And so Mabalja says, look, I'm going to tell you exactly why I chose Al and what it is that makes a true Hellspawn. Meanwhile, back on Earth, we see that Spawn is still, just having a pity party for himself as, he states to Cog, things were so much easier when I was alive. All I had to do was follow orders and kill the people the government told me to. And, being dead is really bumming me out and and it's actually a lot harder than I thought. At this point, Cog tells him, hey, nobody said that being dead was going to be easy. He then states that, after Spawn made a deal with a devil, not the devil, he does specify that he was kind of basically being raked over the coals, that the devils of Hell pride themselves on being tricksters and using people's emotions and sense of grief or loss or duty or whatever it may be to exploit them and use them for their own ends. And that, Mabalja held up his end of the deal and let Spawn see his wife, but that was it. And that now Spawn is basically stuck between a rock and a hard place with a completely raw deal. But he also tells him that, he's not unique, that this has happened to basically every Hellspawn that's ever been sent back to the world of the living. It's at this point, however, that Spawn and Cagliostro's conversation is interrupted when one of the men from the alleyways yells out, hey Al, I've got a friend here I need you to meet, and I told him you could help him out with some of your magic. Spawn looks pretty skeptical about this as he stands up and says, what are you talking about? We then find out that the man in question is a homeless man who's never been introduced, and in fact, he actually doesn't say his name here. He just says that he lives here in the alleyways and that they've never formally met, but he's been around and seen all the crazy stuff that's been happening. But then he states that his friend Freddy here is in a real jam and could use Spawn's help. Fred, of course, then goes on to explain to Spawn everything that has happened with his daughter and states that it's all because he just doesn't have any money and that he could really use some money to get him out of this jam and was hoping that Spawn could help him. However, Spawn gets pretty angry about all of this when he finds out what the two men are asking for and says, are you out of your minds? Like, I can't just make money out of thin air. And if I could, do you really think I'd be living here in piles of trash with all you homeless guys? Kind of like talking down to him, but he makes a good point. If he could just make money appear out of thin air, he definitely wouldn't be living in piles of trash with homeless people. He then states that his only goal here is to protect the people of the alleyways, and he's not concerned about people who live outside of his area. And he yells at them then and tells them to go away and never do this again. It's at this point that Fred kind of breaks down and just wonders what it is he's going to do, and he just feels completely lost and broken at this point. The man who brought him there yells at Spawn and calls him a jerk and tells him, or tries to console Fred and tell him that everything's going to be okay. Cog is actually a little bit hard on Spawn here and says, you shouldn't be this hard on those guys. They see you as a hero when everyone else sees you as evil. Spawn states, though, that he believes they're becoming too reliant on him to fix all of their problems And that the fact that they would come to him with such an odd request just proves that, he's doing too much for them. However, Cog tells him that he's not doing too much. He's just giving them hope. And the fact is that all of them had lost all of the hope they had before he showed up. Meanwhile, back in hell, we get a super cool close-up in a panel of Mabalja holding the small demon in the palm of his hand. It looks fantastic. I really like this image. And he states to them that the thing that makes a great hellspawn is power. The fact that they had power in the world of the living, and that he gave them magical powers that they could have never had otherwise, and that they have to learn how to use and control that power. But then they also realize that the power he gave them is finite, which means that they have to figure out what their next move is. Some of them try to prolong the inevitable by just hiding themselves away and trying to figure a way out of the deal, which has never worked for any of them. Some of them try to become heroic and tell themselves that they're doing these good deeds that will somehow absolve them of their past transgressions and get them out of the deal that they made with Mabalja, which they don't. And some of them just resolve themselves to what they've done and the deal they've made and decide to just basically go on killing sprees so that they can fill out the armies of hell for Mabalja and create as many soldiers as they possibly can until they return back to him. But regardless of what they do, as Mabalja states, they always return back to him. And he believes that essentially he's invincible and that, no matter what any of these spawns ever do, they're always going to wind up back in his service and that he is essentially always going to come out on top. Meanwhile, back on Earth, Spawn finally asks Cog, what is it that you're trying to tell me? And Cog tells him to basically beware and that there are a number of forces that are all trying to, take over and that are all trying to fulfill their own agenda, and that Spawn has to keep his head on a swivel because a lot of things may not be what they seem. Spawn seems pretty confused by this as, Cog tells him you're a marked man and that anything can happen at any time and your next encounter is just a few seconds away. Spawn says, wait a minute, what are you jabbering about? When suddenly he turns into a ball of plasm and teleports out of the alleyway. This is something that Spawn wasn't expecting, but Cog seemed to know full well was about to happen as he tells him on his way out to just learn, my friend. Then Spawn suddenly finds himself reappeared in some sort of beautiful little meadow and is shocked when he is face to face with the angel Gabriel. Now, I should point out this does happen before the Angela miniseries, but this is leading into the Angela miniseries, as Gabriel states that she wants to have a conversation with Spawn and tells him to take a seat and have a glass of wine. He takes her up on the offer and states that, he's kind of wondering what the heck this is all about. She tells him to have some food, but he says he's not hungry. And then she gets down to business and shows him a picture of Angela and asks, do you recognize this woman? He says, of course I recognize her. She tried to kill me several months ago. She states, yeah, that's our Angela, seems about right. But then he asks, why would she try and do that? And Gabriel's like, why not? She's an angel. You're a creature of hell. She probably just wanted to hang your head on the wall of her trophy room. Gabriel then asks Spawn what exactly happened to the lance after his battle with Angela. He states that when she fled, she left it behind and he went to pick it up. But when he did so, he hit a button on the side of the lance that zapped him with some kind of electricity or something that knocked him unconscious and caused him to have a crazy dream. However, at this point, Gabriel corrects Spawn as she receives a plate of strawberries and cream from a waiter that appears out of nowhere and tells him that was no dream. He was actually redefined briefly in terms of levels of reality, and that she nor anyone else really understands exactly how he was able to get back to the Earth plane, and that he must have some powerful friends. She then, though, goes back to her line of questioning and says, so Angela definitely left the lance behind then, huh? He says yes. She then asks, well, what happened to it after that? And he states he doesn't know. It was gone when he got back. This puts a big smile on her face as she says to herself, let's see that bitch wiggle her way out of this one, as she tells Spawn that the check's been taken care of and that he doesn't have to worry about any of the money needed to pay for the wine. Why would he? They're in some weird pocket dimension. But she then issues a warning telling him that this war between heaven and hell is going to happen and that he needs to choose a side because at the end of the war, there's going to be one of two outcomes, hell on earth or heaven on earth, and neither one of those outcomes are going to be hospitable for the people who currently live on earth, and that he's better off not finding himself caught in the middle as she looks him dead in the eye, and then he suddenly teleports back to the alleyway with Cagliostro. Now, you may have noticed on some of these pages, if you've been paying attention, that there's quite a few of Spawn's speech bubbles that don't have the gray outline around them. They have instead just a plain white outline. I'm pretty sure this is just a mistake in the coloring process, as it doesn't happen on every page, and this is like the first issue I've ever seen that happen in. He then states, "What the hell?" Cagliostro corrects him and says, "No, heaven actually, but not the one you and I were taught about. In fact, they actually have little pieces of it dotted around in many different time continuums." Spawn then gets even angrier as he states, "How do you know about all this? Are you some kind of a god?" Cagliostro then takes a swig from his flask and says, "Hardly. I'm actually just a man who is in a predicament very similar to your own." And that he then explains he's trying to figure out how to get out of this and find someone who can finally win and put an end to all this. And he then assures Spawn that this is definitely about winning. Spawn then asks, what's going on with all these angels? And Cog says, they have a need for you, but I'm not exactly sure what it is, and I'm trying to figure that out. Spawn says, well, when you do, how about you let me in on it, because I'm getting really tired of this. We then see back in Hell that Mabalja is laughing as he crushes the little demon creature that he was holding, splattering its eyeballs out and blood goes everywhere. He then states that yes, it is in fact power, and that he's very happy about the fact that Spawn is now being harassed by the forces of heaven, and that he doesn't know what his next move should be, and he's totally confused, and then he just laughs maniacally and is basically completely enchanted by the fact, essentially, that Spawn is completely at a loss for what his next move should be, and that, no matter what he does, it's going to be a choice that brings him closer to being back in hell under the service of Mabalja. We then get an update on Spawn's power level, which is currently at 7,174, as we see that Spawn is sitting in the alleyways with all the other homeless men around him, as he knocks back drinks from a bottle, getting more and more drunk, laughing, finally having a good time. Cog thinks that he's kind of overdoing it, but Spawn's like, hey man, this is the first time I've had, any kind of relief from all this stress. Don't rain on my parade. He then starts to joke around and tell all the men in the alleyways about how he got tricked into giving up his powers to a fat little clown who's actually a demon, so that demon could go kill his brothers, but that the demon ended up honoring his words and coming back and giving Spawn his powers back like he said he would. He's like, can you believe it? A demon actually kept their promise. And this is the first instance that we get of learning about this. This, of course, all happened in the Violator miniseries. If you'd like to know more about that, you can check out all 3 videos I made about each issue of that miniseries in my Spawn miniseries playlist. However, then Spawn is interrupted by the man that we saw earlier who says, you could have done something to help. Spawn is confused and says, I wasn't going to help that fat blue-faced little piece of crap. However, the man interrupts him and says, no, not him, Fred. Spawn says, who's Fred? I don't know what you're talking about. The man says, well, maybe this will jog your memory, as he throws a newspaper in his chest. And Spawn realizes when he reads the title that a man has committed suicide over a custody ruling, and it jogs his memory that this was the man that was brought to him earlier. And he says, oh my God, I'm so sorry, as he gasps. But the man that threw the paper to him says, how do you feel now, hero? Forget it, it doesn't matter. He was from the outside, he doesn't count. Spawn then sulks off into the shadows as the man continues to taunt him and says, that's it, run away, loser. And back in hell, Mabalja is getting a huge kick out of the despair and depression that Spawn is now feeling, as he laughs maniacally throughout the halls of hell and creates echoes that last long and go on for some time, because he realizes that this is, of course, all playing into his plan of, making Spawn live in anguish and bringing him closer to the goals that Mabalja has in mind. On the final page of the story, we see Spawn standing alone in the alleyways, completely engulfed in his cape, as he states in his inner dialogue that, as a dead man walking the streets of New York, this is the first time he's actually truly felt dead. as he's learned the lesson that not only is it his actions that have consequences, it's also his inactions, as we see that the next issue is The Curse. We then, of course, come to image info. Nothing really worth getting into here. It's something we've seen a million times over at this point. We then get to the spawning ground, which of course is the letter section in which readers can write into Todd McFarlane. And surprisingly, all of the letters in this one are actually positive, which is pretty rare for the spawning ground if you've been keeping up. However, there was one interesting letter where a guy actually wrote in asking questions about how the continuity of certain story aspects worked out. And Todd's response is actually kind of funny because he basically tells him that he can't guarantee that the continuity of Spawn is always going to be perfect, and that especially when it comes to the miniseries with different writers, they may not always get everything 100% accurate to the continuity he's set forth in the main story, which I kind of find it funny that Todd is just willing to admit, like, hey man, I'm a big fan of continuity too, but don't hold me to everything because sometimes I'm going to make mistakes. Like, he's just throwing it out there and being honest, which I do applaud him for, but it's kind of strange that he's just going to let people know this early in the game, like, yeah, I'm going to do my best, but it ain't always going to be right, folks. We then get this fantastic 2-page splash by Tim Townsend. I really like this a lot. I mean, obviously there's no background, but I'll forgive it because his rendition of Spawn here is really phenomenal. I love the way that he's done the glowing of his eyes, the way that he's got the powers, radiating around his fist. And, the fact that the inside of his cape is like the depths of outer space is a really cool touch, even though that's not really necessarily something that is something you would see in the comic. It still looks fantastic, so I don't even care. Like, this is just a fantastic, awesome drawing, and I'm really glad that Todd included this. We then once again see the 2-page explanation of the Todd toys being made in the factory that they were being made in I believe, South Korea. We've seen this in multiple other issues, and at this point, I know Todd toys are kind of still new while this was being printed, but they were in stores already, so it wasn't like he still needed to keep using this, like, hey, check out my toys being made. I think this was more of a, hey, I don't need to draw 2 extra pages for this issue, instead of, actually getting the word out, considering that, the toys were already on the shelves at this point. We then get an ad for Angel Visitations, the book by Neil Gaiman. I've never actually seen one of these or had the chance to buy it, but I would if I did. We also have seen advertisements for this in some other different issues, also the Angela miniseries. If you'd like to know more about the Angela miniseries, by the way, feel free to check out all 3 videos I have about the Angela miniseries, which is in the Spawn miniseries playlist. We then see an advertisement for the Image Universe Founders series, which of course are collectible trading cards produced by Topps. I don't have any of these, but I would like to have the whole set. I mean, I'm not a huge collector card guy, but when it comes to Image, I do have a soft spot for it, obviously, if you've been paying attention on the channel. And this is just a cool little piece of memorabilia I'd like to have. We then see an advertisement for Wizard Magazine number 42 on sale in January, where you got to pick between having the good guy covers or the bad guy covers. But either way, it was pretty cool because they were all Alex Ross designs and they look fantastic. And on the reverse inside cover, we get an advertisement for Angela number 1. And as I just stated, if you'd like to know more about the Angela miniseries, check out my videos on all 3 issues in the Spawn miniseries playlist. And that was Spawn number 26. Overall, I thought it was a pretty good book. There's a lot of exposition, there's a lot of dialogue, there's a lot of story elements at play, and at times it can be a little bit confusing, but as the story progresses, a lot of what goes on in this issue makes a lot more sense. And specifically, there was one part in this book in which Cagliostro foreshadowed some stuff that doesn't come to fruition for like a long time. And I had forgotten about it completely, and then it jogged my memory when I read it, exactly what he was talking about. And knowing exactly how far into the future that actually plays out, I got to give it to Todd. He might have done it by accident, or maybe he just did it on purpose and was thinking that far ahead. But either way, it worked out fantastically. And it's really cool to see that something talked about in an issue this early would basically come to fruition in an issue that's way, way, way further down the road. And that's one of the things I love about going back and reading these books that I haven't looked at for, well over a decade. But then again, these are just my opinions. Your opinions may differ. You may have thought this book was really terrible and not liked anything that it had to offer. But if that's the case, it's okay, because everyone's entitled to their own opinions. If you enjoyed today's video, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And thanks for stopping by. Have a great day.